bunting strung between the ancient yew trees of St. Mary Mead's churchyard fluttered with determined cheerfulness, as though the very fabric had been instructed to be festive and dared not disappoint. It was the afternoon of the annual flower and harvest fete, that most sacred of village traditions, where the respectable residents of St. Mary Mead gathered to admire each other's preserves, compete over the straightness of their runner beans, and exchange the sort of gossip that masqueraded as Christian concern for one's neighbors. Miss Jane Marple sat beneath the spreading branches of the great chestnut tree, her knitting needles moving with the steady rhythm of someone who had long ago learned that the best observations were made when one appeared to be paying attention to something else entirely. Her pale blue eyes, sharp as winter morning, took in the familiar tableau. Mrs. Dolly Bantry presiding over the white elephant stall with military precision, the Reverend Leonard Clement attempting to look pastoral while clearly fretting about the weather, and young Dr. Haydock sampling Mrs. Price's Victoria sponge with the dedicated expression of a man performing a civic duty. The churchyard itself provided a peculiar backdrop for such festivities. Ancient headstones leaned at companionable angles, their inscriptions worn smooth by centuries of English weather, while newer monuments stood at attention like well-dressed soldiers on parade. The contrast between the living celebration and the eternal residence created an atmosphere that was uniquely English in its comfortable acceptance of mortality's proximity to merriment. "Such a lovely turnout," observed Mrs. Price, the postmistress, whose position afforded her both official and unofficial access to the village's communications. She paused beside Miss Marple's chair, her eyes scanning the crowd with the practiced efficiency of someone who made it her business to know everyone else's business. Though I must say, I'm surprised to see certain people have chosen to attend. Miss Marple's needles continued their gentle clicking. "Oh?" she inquired with the mild interest of someone who had learned that the most revealing conversations began with the smallest encouragements. "Mrs. Althea Nash," Mrs. Price continued, lowering her voice to that particular register reserved for the most delicious scandals. "Back from Spain, or wherever it was she fled to after that dreadful business with poor Mr. Enderby. Widow now, I'm told, though one wonders about the circumstances. Foreign countries, you know, so difficult to verify these things properly." Following Mrs. Price's meaningful glance, Miss Marple observed a slender woman in an elegant lavender dress moving through the crowd with the careful grace of someone who knew she was being watched. Mrs. Nash appeared to be in her early 40s, with prematurely silver hair arranged in a style that spoke of expensive salons and careful maintenance. She carried herself with the particular poise of someone who had once been very beautiful and had learned to make dignity serve where beauty had begun to fade. "She seems to be heading toward the old section," Miss Marple noted, observing Mrs. Nash's path through the festivities toward the shadowed area, where the oldest graves clustered beneath the protective canopy of ancient yews. "Paying her respects, no doubt," Mrs. Price sniffed, "though what respects she has to pay to anyone in St. Mary Mead is beyond my understanding. She left here under such a cloud, and now she returns as though nothing had happened. Some people have remarkably convenient memories." The afternoon progressed with the comfortable predictability of a well-rehearsed play. Tea was served with ceremonial importance. Children ran between the stalls with sticky fingers and bright faces, and the gentle murmur of village conversation created a pleasant backdrop to the more serious business of examining prize vegetables and debating the merits of various jam recipes. It was young Tommy Pierce, the sexton's grandson, who disrupted this peaceful scene. The boy had been exploring the churchyard with the fearless curiosity of youth when his voice suddenly cut through the afternoon air like a blade through silk. "Grandad, Grandad, there's a lady sleeping in Mr. Enderby's grave." The effect was immediate and profound. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, teacups paused halfway to lips, and every head turned toward the source of the disturbance. Mr. Amos Willard, the sexton, dropped his prize dahlia and hurried toward his grandson with the particular urgency of someone who knew that children's observations, however innocently delivered, often contained uncomfortable truths. Miss Marple rose from her chair with deliberate calm, her knitting carefully set aside. She had learned long ago that moments of crisis revealed more about human nature than years of ordinary observation. And something in the quality of the boy's cry suggested that this was no ordinary afternoon's excitement. The small crowd that gathered around the freshly dug grave created a circle of horrified fascination. There, arranged with almost ceremonial precision in the earth that had been prepared for Mr. Enderby's burial the following morning, lay Mrs. Althea Nash. Her lavender dress was unmarked by soil, her silver hair remained perfectly arranged, and her pale hands were folded across her chest as though she had simply chosen to lie down for an eternal rest. Dr. Haydock, summoned by urgent whispers, knelt beside the grave with professional efficiency. His examination was brief but thorough, and when he rose, his expression carried the gravity of unwelcome certainty. "She's been dead for some time," he announced quietly. "Several hours, I should estimate, and there are no obvious signs of violence, though of course a proper examination will be necessary." Miss Marple positioned herself at the edge of the gathering, her keen eyes taking in details that others, in their shock and fascination, might overlook. She noted the way Mrs. Nash's body had been arranged, not carelessly deposited, but placed with deliberate care. She observed the small white envelope that protruded from the woman's handbag, which lay beside the grave as though it had been set down rather than dropped. Most significantly, she noticed the single white rose that had been placed in Mrs. Nash's folded hands, its stem cut with precision and its petals still fresh despite the afternoon warmth. "How perfectly dreadful," whispered Mrs. Bantry, though her eyes remained fixed on the scene with the fascination that tragedy invariably inspired in the living. "To think that poor woman came to our little fate, and then— but how on earth did she end up in Mr. Enderby's grave?" It was, Miss Marple reflected, an excellent question. Mr. Enderby had died 3 days earlier after a brief illness, and his funeral was scheduled for the following morning. The grave had been prepared that very afternoon by Mr. Willard and his assistant, covered with boards and left ready for the morning service. For Mrs. Nash to have ended up inside it suggested either a remarkable coincidence or something far more deliberate. As Constable Polk arrived to take charge of the scene and the crowd began to disperse into excited clusters of speculation, Miss Marple remained beside the grave, her mind already beginning to sort through the questions that would need answering. Who was Mrs. Althea Nash, really, and what had brought her back to St. Mary Mead after so many years? What connection had she to Mr. Enderby, whose grave had become her final resting place? And most intriguingly, what message had someone intended to convey by arranging this macabre tableau at the village's most cherished annual celebration? The afternoon sun continued to slant through the yew branches, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow across the churchyard, but the festive atmosphere had evaporated as completely as morning mist. The woman who had slept in the wrong grave had transformed St. Mary Mead's peaceful fate into something far more sinister, and Miss Marple suspected that before this mystery was resolved, several of her neighbors would discover that their carefully maintained secrets were not nearly as secure as they had believed. In the distance, the church bells began their evening call, their bronze voices carrying across the village with the same steady rhythm they had maintained for centuries. But today, Miss Marple reflected, those bells would toll for more than just the faithful gathering for evensong. They would mark the beginning of a mystery that would test everything she had learned about the intricate and often dangerous relationships that flourished beneath the surface of even the most respectable English village. By evening, the bunting still fluttered with determined cheerfulness above St. Mary Mead's churchyard, but the village itself hummed with an entirely different energy than the afternoon had promised. News of Mrs. Althea Nash's death spread through the narrow lanes and cottage gardens with the inexorable efficiency of spilled water finding every crack in ancient stonework. Kitchen windows glowed with unusual animation as neighbors gathered over hastily brewed tea to dissect the afternoon's shocking discovery, each retelling adding fresh embellishments to an already extraordinary tale. Miss Marple, having declined Mrs. Bantry's pressing invitation to analyze the tragedy over sherry and speculation, chose instead her customary evening walk through the village. Her pale blue eyes, sharp as winter frost, observed the fragments of conversation that drifted from open windows and garden gates, while her knitting bag swung gently at her side like a familiar talisman against the growing darkness. At the Blue Boar, animated voices had replaced the usual discussions of cricket scores and weather patterns. The postmistress, Mrs. Price, had established herself as the unofficial authority on the deceased woman's history, holding court in her sitting room above the post office while a steady stream of visitors came to hear her carefully curated recollections. According to Mrs. Price's version of events, Mrs. Nash had been Althea Fairfax 15 years earlier, a young woman of modest means who had worked as companion to old Mrs. Enderby at the grand house on the hill. The arrangement seemed perfectly respectable, Mrs. Price declared to her rapt audience, until whispers began about her relationship with Mrs. Enderby's nephew Harold, a married man, mind you, with a reputation for charm and weakness where attractive women were concerned. The scandal had deepened when Mrs. Enderby suddenly changed her will, leaving her considerable fortune not to her nephew as expected, but to her young companion. Harold Enderby had contested the will, claiming undue influence, but the legal proceedings were abandoned when Althea Fairfax disappeared one night, taking only a suitcase and leaving behind a brief note about starting fresh where her reputation wouldn't precede her. Dr. Haydock, making his evening rounds with methodical precision, found himself besieged by anxious residents seeking both medical reassurance and insider information. His preliminary examination had revealed no obvious signs of violence, but something about the woman's peaceful expression and carefully arranged posture troubled him in ways he couldn't articulate. The fact that she had been discovered in Harold Enderby's prepared grave seemed too pointed for mere coincidence, yet he could conceive of no rational explanation for such bizarre circumstances. Inspector Slack arrived from Much Benham as darkness settled over the village, his usual professional competence slightly strained by the peculiar nature of the case. He established temporary headquarters in the church vestry, much to Reverend Clement's poorly concealed distress, and began the methodical process of interviewing everyone who had attended the fete. His approach was thorough but conventional, focusing on establishing a timeline of Mrs. Nash's movements and identifying anyone who might have spoken with her during the afternoon. The envelope found in her handbag contained a brief letter from a London solicitor informing her that certain legal matters regarding her late husband's estate required personal attention, but nothing that seemed to connect directly to her presence in St. Mary Mead or her mysterious death. Harold Enderby, summoned for questioning, presented himself as genuinely bewildered by events, claiming no knowledge of Mrs. Nash's return and insisting he hadn't seen or spoken to her in 15 years. His alibi for the afternoon was solid, supported by multiple witnesses, yet something in his nervous energy suggested to observant residents that Harold Enderby wasn't telling the complete truth about his connection to the deceased woman. Mrs. Bantry appointed herself unofficial liaison between the official investigation and village curiosity, bustling between various centers of speculation with the enthusiasm of a general marshalling intelligence reports. Her drawing room became an informal headquarters for dedicated amateur detectives, where theories multiplied with each retelling. Mrs. Nash had returned to claim forgotten inheritance, to expose long-hidden secrets, or had simply suffered some medical episode and fallen into the prepared grave during confusion or distress. Miss Marple found herself particularly intrigued by reactions from those claiming to barely know the deceased woman. The vehemence with which certain residents insisted on complete ignorance seemed disproportionate to circumstances, suggesting Mrs. Nash's return had awakened fears dormant for many years. The white rose in the dead woman's hands had been identified as coming from the memorial garden behind the vestry, but no one could explain who had placed it there or why such symbolic gesture had been made. Young Jerry Burton, recently arrived and less steeped in village traditions of respectful denial, muttered theories about lovers' quarrels and jealous foreigners to his sister Joanna, while Mr. Amos Willard, the sexton, hovered near the cordoned area with peculiar intensity, his face showing deep personal affront as if the desecration of Mr. Enderby's grave was a direct attack on his professional integrity. As Miss Marple completed her circuit of the village, observing how everyone constructed narratives that made sense within their personal world-view, she reflected that murder was rarely simple. Its roots often lay tangled deep within society's fabric, nurtured by long-held resentments and unspoken desires. The woman who slept in the wrong grave had ripped a gaping hole in the carefully woven tapestry of village life, and the threads, once unraveled, would reveal far more than anyone wished to see. Morning arrived in St. Mary Mead with the peculiar quality of light that follows disruption, as though the very atmosphere had been charged with questions that demanded answers. Miss Marple rose earlier than her usual custom, her sleep having been interrupted not by physical discomfort, but by the restless turning of thoughts that refused to arrange themselves into satisfactory patterns. From her cottage window, she observed the steady procession of official vehicles making their way toward the churchyard, each one carrying the weight of metropolitan authority into their peaceful village sanctuary. Inspector Slack had established his temporary headquarters in the church vestry, much to Reverend Clement's poorly concealed distress, and proceeded with the methodical thoroughness that characterized his approach to criminal investigation. His team photographed the gravesite from every conceivable angle, measured distances with scientific precision, and interviewed witnesses with the systematic efficiency of men who believed that truth could be extracted through proper procedure and careful documentation. Yet Miss Marple, observing from a respectful distance during her morning constitutional, noted that the inspector's focus remained fixed on the obvious questions while potentially overlooking the subtle inconsistencies that often proved most revealing in matters involving human nature. The first significant discovery came from young Tommy Pierce, whose sharp eyes had noticed details that escaped more sophisticated observers. When questioned again about his initial sighting of the sleeping lady, the boy recalled seeing Mrs. Nash speaking with a gentleman near the lych gate shortly before her discovery. The man wore a brown felt hat and shoes that squeaked when he turned, Tommy reported with the precision of youth, and he had been whistling a tune that sounded like something the church organist played during services. This detail struck Miss Marple as particularly significant, though she kept her observations to herself while listening to the animated discussions that surrounded the investigation. Dr. Haydock's preliminary examination revealed that Mrs. Nash had died from apparent cardiac arrest, though her relatively young age and previously robust health made such a conclusion troubling without more detailed analysis. More intriguingly, the careful arrangement of her body and the symbolic placement of the white rose in her folded hands suggested deliberate staging rather than natural death. The rose itself provided an unexpected clue when Reverend Clement mentioned that it had been cut from the memorial garden behind the vestry, but the cutting showed the rough edges of a pocket knife rather than the clean precision of proper secateurs. A thorough search of the area yielded another piece of evidence that deepened the mystery considerably. Constable Polk discovered a small silver locket partially hidden beneath the rose bushes, bearing the initials AF in elegant script and containing a photograph of a young man whose features bore unmistakable resemblance to Harold Enderby from decades earlier. The discovery suggested that Mrs. Nash had maintained sentimental attachment to her past connections with St. Mary Mead, contradicting the prevailing narrative of a calculating woman who had fled with stolen inheritance and never looked back with genuine emotion. Harold Enderby's behavior throughout the morning struck several observers as peculiar for a man supposedly uninvolved in the tragic events. Rather than maintaining dignified distance appropriate for someone mourning his uncle's recent death, he seemed compelled to insert himself into every conversation about Mrs. Nash, offering unsolicited details about their past acquaintance and emphasizing repeatedly that their relationship had been entirely proper despite malicious village gossip. His insistence on innocence, delivered to anyone willing to listen, created the unfortunate impression of someone protesting far more than circumstances warranted. Miss Marple encountered him outside the post office, where he appeared to be waiting with the specific purpose of ensuring she understood his complete lack of involvement in recent events. His explanation revealed more than he perhaps intended about the true nature of his past relationship with Althea Fairfax, describing her as a scheming adventuress who had manipulated his elderly aunt through calculated kindness. The vehemence of his denunciation struck Miss Marple as disproportionate to events that had occurred 15 years earlier, suggesting that Harold's feelings remained remarkably fresh despite the passage of time. Additional information emerged through the efficient village gossip network that rivaled any official investigation. Mrs. Dorothy Finch, whose sharp eyes missed little from her cottage opposite the churchyard, reported seeing a dark foreign car parked near the lych gate around the time Mrs. Nash was last seen alive. The detail had seemed insignificant during the festive afternoon, but in retrospect provided another thread in the increasingly complex tapestry of events. The landlord at the Blue Boar revealed that Mrs. Nash had left a sealed envelope marked only with the initials H.E. and had inquired specifically about Harold Enderby's evening habits. Later, a gentleman in a brown hat had asked about messages, though the landlord's professional discretion had prevented him from revealing the envelope's existence to anyone but the intended recipient. As evening approached and the official investigation continued its methodical progress, Miss Marple reflected on the peculiar quality of secrets in small communities. Like underground streams that occasionally surfaced in unexpected places, the hidden current of village life could remain invisible for years before circumstances forced them into daylight. The woman who had slept in the wrong grave had clearly returned to St. Mary Mead for purposes more complex than settling legal matters, and her death had occurred at a moment of particular significance that extended far beyond coincidence. The white rose whispered of ceremony and intention, while the careful arrangement suggested someone had wanted to make a statement that transcended simple murder, revealing truths that some had hoped would remain buried forever. By mid-morning, Inspector Slack had arranged his evidence with the satisfaction of a man who appreciated clear lines of causation and straightforward motives. The sealed envelope retrieved from the Blue Boar provided what he considered the keystone of his case against Harold Enderby, containing a brief note in Mrs. Nash's distinctive handwriting requesting a private meeting at 4 o'clock in the Memorial Garden. Harold's vehement denials that he had received or responded to such communication struck the inspector as precisely the sort of protestation one expected from guilty parties caught in carefully laid traps of their own making. The interview conducted in the church vestry revealed Harold in a state of nervous agitation that seemed disproportionate to the circumstances, his explanations shifting between indignant denial and elaborate justification with the unpredictable rhythm of a man whose prepared story was crumbling under methodical questioning. He insisted repeatedly that his relationship with Althea Fairfax had been entirely proper, a claim that rang hollow when confronted with the intimate photograph found in her locket and the obvious bitterness that colored his recollections of their past association. Young Tommy Pierce's testimony about the brown-hatted gentleman provided additional corroboration when Harold appeared for questioning wearing new leather brogues that announced his every movement with distinctive squeaks. The boy's description of the mysterious whistling proved more troubling, however, as Harold demonstrated complete inability to carry a tune and showed no familiarity with the hymnal melodies that formed the soundtrack to village worship. Dr. Haydock's more detailed examination yielded disturbing revelations about the circumstances of Mrs. Nash's death. revealing traces of a mild sedative in her system that could have precipitated the cardiac episode that killed her. The medication was readily available to anyone with access to modern medical supplies, broadening rather than narrowing the field of potential suspects, though Inspector Slack remained focused on Harold's obvious motive and opportunity. Village opinion crystallized around Harold's guilt with the inexorable force of communal judgment seeking resolution. Mrs. Bantry held court in her drawing room, recounting Harold's past displays of temper and his persistent resentment over the contested inheritance, while Mrs. Price documented every detail of the original scandal with the thoroughness of an official historian. The consensus that emerged painted Harold as a weak man, driven to desperate action by years of festering grievance and the sudden reappearance of the woman who had destroyed his expectations. Miss Marple observed these developments with the detached interest of someone who had learned that obvious solutions often concealed more complex truths. Harold's character, as she remembered it from his youth, ran toward impulsive outbursts and dramatic gestures, but the careful staging of Mrs. Nash's death suggested a different sort of mind entirely. The precise arrangement of the body, the symbolic placement of the white rose, and the deliberate choice of Harold's uncle's grave as the final resting place spoke of calculation and ceremony that seemed inconsistent with Harold's blunt temperament. The rose itself provided additional cause for reflection when Miss Marple examined the memorial garden from which it had been taken. The cutting showed the rough edges of hasty work with a dull blade, yet the selection and placement demonstrated intimate knowledge of the church grounds and their symbolic significance. Harold's claim that he had loaned his pocket knife to the sexton proved impossible to verify when Mr. Willard flatly denied any such transaction, leaving questions about who had possessed the necessary tools and opportunity. More intriguingly, several witnesses reported seeing a dark foreign automobile parked near the churchyard during the afternoon, suggesting connections that extended beyond the insular world of village relationships. Mrs. Nash's substantial cash withdrawals in the days preceding her death indicated preparation for immediate departure, while correspondence from Barcelona revealed potential criminal complications that cast her return to St. Mary Mead in an entirely different light than nostalgic reconciliation. The envelope addressed to H.E. raised additional questions about intended recipients and intercepted communications, as Harold's initials were shared by at least 2 other village residents whose involvement remained unexplored. The assumption that Mrs. Nash had sought private meeting with Harold ignored possibilities of mistaken identity or deliberate misdirection by someone seeking to implicate him in circumstances beyond his control. As evening approached and Inspector Slack prepared formal charges based on circumstantial evidence and village consensus, Miss Marple reflected on the peculiar quality of secrets in small communities. The woman who had slept in the wrong grave had clearly returned with purposes extending beyond settling old scores, carrying with her complications that threatened multiple residents' carefully maintained facades. The theatrical nature of her death suggested someone who understood the power of symbolic gestures and possessed sufficient knowledge of village dynamics to craft a narrative that would satisfy official investigation while concealing deeper truths. The white rose whispered of ceremony and remembrance, while the careful staging spoke of minds that thought in terms of meaning rather than mere disposal. Harold Enderby might possess motive and opportunity, but the artistry of the crime scene suggested sensibilities that transcended simple revenge, pointing towards secrets that had remained buried far longer than 15 years and threatened consequences that extended well beyond one man's resentment over a contested inheritance. The arrest of Harold Enderby proceeded with Inspector Slack's characteristic efficiency, yet Miss Marple found herself increasingly troubled by the accumulating inconsistencies that refused to align themselves with the neat narrative of guilt and retribution that had satisfied both official investigation and village opinion. Harold's protests carried the unmistakable quality of genuine bewilderment rather than calculated denial. his complete unfamiliarity with the Memorial Garden's layout becoming embarrassingly apparent when he confidently misdirected Constable Polk toward entirely the wrong section of the churchyard, revealing ignorance that any local resident planning such an elaborate crime would necessarily have remedied through careful reconnaissance. Miss Marple's morning constitutional took her past the church, where she paused to examine the memorial garden with the methodical attention of someone who understood that truth often resided in details too small for official notice. The white rose bushes showed several recent harvests, but one stem near the back bore the telltale marks of hasty cutting with a damaged blade, creating the rough, furred edges she had observed on the rose found in Mrs. Nash's hands. The particular pattern suggested a knife with a notched tip, the sort of distinctive damage that would leave consistent marks across multiple cuttings. Her path through the vestry brought an unexpected encounter with Mr. Hubert Ellison, the church organist, who seemed unusually flustered for a man typically composed in his musical domain. His brown felt hat lay on the back pew, and his newly polished shoes announced every movement with the distinctive squeaks that had caught young Tommy Pierce's sharp attention. More significantly, his unconscious whistling of a complex voluntary matched perfectly the melody the boy had described, demonstrating both the musical ability and the specific repertoire that Harold Enderby completely lacked. When Miss Marple requested assistance with cutting some troublesome twine, Mr. Ellison obligingly offered his penknife, revealing a blade with the precise notch pattern she had expected to find. His right thumb bore traces of green florist's tape, and his explanation about sacristy gloves came too quickly, suggesting preparation for questions about avoiding thorn scratches that Dr. Haydock had noted were absent from Mrs. Nash's hands. The combination of musical ability, physical evidence, and nervous behavior painted a picture that contradicted every assumption about the mysterious brown-hatted gentleman. The broader context of Mrs. Nash's return proved equally revealing when correspondence discovered in her hotel room exposed the true circumstances of her journey to England. Letters from Barcelona indicated that her late husband's business associates had grown dangerously impatient with delays in settling certain accounts, and her substantial cash withdrawals suggested preparation for immediate flight rather than nostalgic reconciliation with her past. The timing of her death, occurring just hours before her planned departure, transformed coincidence into something far more sinister. Additional inquiries revealed that the foreign automobiles several witnesses had noticed belonged to no local rental agency, suggesting connections that extended well beyond St. Mary Mead's familiar boundaries. Mrs. Nash had been fleeing threats rather than pursuing voluntary reunion, carrying secrets that made her both valuable and dangerous to parties unknown. The theatrical staging of her death, with its careful symbolism and precise timing, indicated intervention by someone who understood both her desperate circumstances and the village dynamics that could be manipulated to provide convenient scapegoats. The hidden clue that crystallized Miss Marple's growing suspicions emerged during casual conversation with Reverend Clement, whose innocent mention of their former organist's habits provided the missing piece of a complex puzzle. Mr. Davies, recently retired due to rheumatism, had been known for his constant whistling of sacred melodies while tending the memorial garden, particularly his favorite, Eternal Father, Strong to Save. His brown felt hat and recently acquired squeaky boots matched Tommy Pierce's description perfectly, while his methodical temperament and intimate knowledge of church grounds provided both opportunity and capability for the crime's elaborate staging. The envelope addressed to H.E. took on entirely new significance when viewed through the lens of mistaken identity, as Hubert Ellison's initials matched Harold Enderby's exactly. Mrs. Nash's request for a private meeting had been intended for the organist, not the nephew, suggesting connections that predated her recent desperate circumstances by many years. The careful arrangement of her body, the symbolic placement of the white rose, and the choice of Harold's uncle's grave as the final resting place all spoke of someone with both intimate knowledge of village relationships and the artistic sensibility to craft meaning from tragedy. As evening settled over St. Mary Mead and Harold Enderby spent another night in custody for crimes he had not committed, Miss Marple reflected on the dangerous intersection of past secrets and present desperation that had transformed their peaceful village into a stage for carefully orchestrated deception. The woman who had slept in the wrong grave had carried threats that extended far beyond a contested inheritance, and her death had been arranged by someone who understood that the most effective murders were those that provided obvious suspects while concealing the true architect of destruction beneath layers of misdirection and false assumption. Inspector Slack's confidence in Harold Enderby's guilt began to waver as the second day of investigation revealed troubling inconsistencies that his methodical mind could not easily dismiss. Harold's complete unfamiliarity with the Memorial Gardens layout had become embarrassingly apparent during questioning. His misdirection of Constable Pork toward entirely wrong sections of the churchyard, revealing ignorance that seemed incompatible with planning such an elaborate crime. Moreover, the careful staging of Mrs. Nash's body suggested artistic sensibilities and intimate knowledge of church grounds that Harold's blunt temperament and obvious discomfort with sacred spaces made increasingly implausible. Miss Marple's morning visit to Mr. Davies, the retired organist, ostensibly to deliver Mrs. Bantry's damson preserves, yielded revelations that shifted the investigation's focus entirely. The elderly man's arthritic hands made cutting roses impossible, he explained with rueful honesty, gesturing toward the brown felt hat hanging on its familiar peg and the squeaky leather boots waiting by the hearth. Both items had been given to his successor, Hubert Ellison, along with various other tools and accessories that the younger man had requested for his expanded duties maintaining the memorial garden. The implications struck Miss Marple with crystalline clarity as she recalled young Tommy Pierce's precise description of the mysterious, brown-hatted gentleman. Mr. Davies's generous nature and Ellison's practical requests had created the perfect opportunity for borrowed identity, allowing the current organist to move through the churchyard with familiar authority while wearing distinctively memorable accessories that would misdirect suspicion toward his predecessor. Further investigation revealed that Ellison possessed the damaged penknife whose distinctive notched blade had created the rough cuts observed on the white rose stem. His explanation for the tool's condition, involving reed adjustments and string maintenance, carried the ring of musical authenticity, yet the green stains on his thumb suggested recent contact with florist's tape rather than instrumental repairs. When questioned about his activities during the fete, Ellison's responses showed the careful preparation of someone who had anticipated such inquiries, yet his nervous energy and tendency toward over-explanation created exactly the opposite impression of innocence he sought to convey. The envelope addressed to H.E. took on entirely new significance when viewed through the lens of shared initials rather than obvious identification. Mrs. Nash's request for a private meeting could easily have been intended for Hubert Ellison rather than Harold Enderby, particularly given the organist's regular presence in the memorial garden and his reputation for discretion in parish matters. The confusion of identities provided perfect cover for someone seeking clandestine communication while creating circumstances that would implicate an innocent party when tragedy inevitably followed. Additional evidence emerged through patient observation of Ellison's behavior during the crisis. His intimate knowledge of Mrs. Nash's movements throughout the afternoon, demonstrated through casual comments about her conversations and whereabouts, suggested surveillance rather than coincidental awareness. His unconscious whistling of complex sacred melodies matched Tommy Pierce's description perfectly, while his newly acquired squeaky boots announced his presence with distinctive audio signatures that the sharp-eared boy had noticed immediately. The memorial garden itself provided further confirmation of Ellison's involvement, when careful examination revealed multiple recent rose cuttings, all bearing the characteristic marks of his notched penknife. His selection of the particular white rose variety, known as bride's memory, according to the garden's careful labeling, suggested symbolic intention rather than random choice, implying knowledge of Mrs. Nash's past and deliberate commentary on her circumstances. Village gossip, filtered through Mrs. Price's efficient intelligence network, revealed that Ellison had made unusual inquiries about correspondence addressed to H.E. in recent weeks, displaying anxiety about potential misdirected mail that seemed disproportionate to normal postal confusion. His agitation whenever Mrs. Nash's name arose in conversation, combined with his tendency to volunteer information about their supposed lack of connection, created the impression of someone protesting far more than circumstances warranted. The discovery of crumpled correspondence in the vestry wastebasket, bearing Mrs. Nash's distinctive handwriting and addressing "Dear Hubert" in terms suggesting previous acquaintance, contradicted Ellison's claims of complete unfamiliarity with the deceased woman. The intimate tone and references to shared memories and unfinished conversations implied a relationship extending far beyond casual village interactions, providing motive that had remained completely hidden beneath his carefully maintained facade of musical dedication and religious devotion. Dr. Haydock's analysis of the sedative found in Mrs. Nash's system revealed a professional-grade preparation that required specific knowledge and access to medical supplies, broadening the investigation beyond Harold's obvious connection to the surgery. Ellison's nervous temperament and occasional requests for calming remedies from the doctor suggested familiarity with such medications that could easily have been exploited for more sinister purposes. As evening settled over St. Mary Mead and Harold remained in custody despite mounting evidence of his innocence, Miss Marple reflected on the dangerous intersection of past, secrets, and present desperation that had transformed their peaceful village into a stage for carefully orchestrated deception. The woman who had slept in the wrong grave had clearly carried threats extending beyond contested inheritance, and her death bore all the hallmarks of someone who understood village dynamics well enough to manipulate them for murderous purposes, while maintaining the appearance of respectability and innocence that made detection so challenging. The morning of the third day brought developments that transformed Inspector Slack's methodical investigation into something approaching genuine alarm, beginning with Mrs. Dorothy Finch's breathless arrival at the temporary headquarters, with observations that cast the entire case in an international light she had not previously considered relevant. Her sharp eyes, trained by years of diplomatic service alongside her late husband, had noted that the occupants of the mysterious foreign automobile were not casual tourists, but professional observers, their expensive suits and patient surveillance suggesting connections far beyond village boundaries. The men had remained in their vehicle throughout the fete, she reported with growing excitement, conducting animated conversations in Spanish while watching the churchyard, with the focused intensity of hunters awaiting their quarry. Their agitation increasing noticeably as the afternoon progressed without Mrs. Nash emerging from the festivities as expected. Miss Marple, listening with the careful attention she reserved for details that others might dismiss, recognized immediately that Mrs. Nash's death had occurred under circumstances of active surveillance, transforming what appeared to be domestic tragedy into something approaching international conspiracy. The implications multiplied when Constable Pelk discovered additional correspondence in Mrs. Nash's hotel room, revealing financial entanglements with Barcelona import businesses that had attracted unwelcome attention from both Spanish authorities and less official interested parties, her hasty departure carrying substantial cash, suggesting flight from immediate physical danger rather than nostalgic reconciliation with her English past. Hubert Ellison's behavior during the morning service provided additional confirmation of involvement extending far beyond simple village murder, his musical selections showing uncharacteristic discord while his hands trembled visibly during the offertory, his responses to Reverend Clement's gentle inquiries carrying the brittle quality of someone maintaining composure through desperate willpower. Most significantly, young Tommy Pierce reported seeing the organist emerging from the vestry late on the evening before Mrs. Nash's death, carrying what appeared to be a small medical vial and moving with furtive haste toward the old well behind the church, an observation that made little sense until viewed through the lens of evidence destruction. Constable. Polk's recovery of the discarded container revealed traces of the same sedative found in Mrs. Nash's system, along with fingerprints matching those taken from Ellison during routine elimination procedures, creating a web of physical evidence that contradicted every claim of innocence the organist had maintained. The foreign automobile's immediate departure following news of Mrs. Nash's death suggested either satisfaction with events or recognition that their quarry could no longer provide information they sought, while Ellison's visible relief during subsequent days indicated that her elimination had resolved immediate threats while creating new complications requiring careful management. Additional investigation revealed correspondence between Ellison and several European addresses, including a Barcelona postal box that had received regular payments from an account bearing Mrs. Nash's maiden name. Financial arrangements dating from her initial departure 15 years earlier that had made her both valuable and dangerous to parties seeking to exploit her husband's questionable business practices. Inspector Slack's renewed interview with the organist, conducted with awareness of his true involvement, revealed a man whose carefully constructed facade was crumbling under methodical questioning, his claims of complete innocence ringing increasingly hollow when confronted with physical evidence, witness testimony, and financial records painting a picture of long-term deception and recent desperate action. The theatrical staging of Mrs. Nash's death, with its careful symbolism and precise timing, reflected artistic sensibilities of someone who thought in terms of dramatic effect and understood the power of visual narrative to shape interpretation, while his choice of Harold's uncle's grave demonstrated intimate knowledge of family dynamics that would provide convenient scapegoats for official investigation. Miss Marple, observing Ellison's increasingly erratic attempts to maintain his position while evidence accumulated against him, recognized the dangerous intersection of international intrigue and village respectability that had transformed their peaceful community into a stage for murder disguised as domestic tragedy. The woman who slept in the wrong grave having carried secrets extending far beyond contested inheritance into realms of currency speculation, tax avoidance, and criminal enterprises that made her elimination both profitable and necessary for parties operating across national boundaries with ruthless efficiency. Miss Marple understood with crystalline clarity that Inspector Slack's methodical approach, while admirable in its thoroughness, would require more compelling evidence than circumstantial observations and village gossip to shift focus from Harold Enderby to the true perpetrator. Hubert Ellison's carefully constructed facade of musical devotion and quiet respectability had served as perfect camouflage for years, and direct accusation would only prompt denials that his nervous temperament might sustain under official questioning. What the situation required was the sort of psychological pressure that Miss Marple had learned to apply with devastating effectiveness, using seemingly innocent conversation to probe the guilty conscience until it betrayed itself through reactions that no amount of preparation could adequately conceal. Her opportunity arose during the morning following Harold's arrest, when she encountered Ellison in the vestry arranging sheet music with the obsessive precision of someone seeking control through familiar rituals. The familiar scent of beeswax and ancient wood created an atmosphere of sacred tranquility that seemed to mock the dark purposes for which these holy spaces had recently been employed, while afternoon light filtered through stained glass windows cast jeweled patterns across surfaces that had witnessed both worship and calculated murder within the span of a single week. "Good morning, Mr. Ellison." Miss Marple greeted him with the gentle courtesy that had disarmed countless suspects over the years, her pale blue eyes taking careful inventory of his appearance and demeanor. "Such a relief that this dreadful business seems to be reaching its conclusion, though one cannot help feeling sorry for poor Harold, despite everything." Ellison's response carried the brittle quality of someone maintaining composure through desperate willpower, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted already perfectly aligned hymnal pages with unnecessary attention to detail. "Indeed, Miss Marple," he replied, his voice pitched slightly higher than normal conversation required. Though I must say, the whole affair has been terribly unsettling for everyone involved. One hopes the village can return to normal now that justice has been served. His unconscious emphasis on the word justice struck Miss Marple as particularly revealing, suggesting someone who had convinced himself that recent events represented appropriate retribution rather than cold-blooded murder motivated by self-preservation and financial desperation. Miss Marple moved closer to examine the memorial garden through the vestry window, her observation apparently casual, while actually calculated to increase psychological pressure on someone whose guilt was intimately connected to those rose beds. "The white roses are particularly beautiful this time of year," she remarked with innocent appreciation, though I noticed someone had been rather careless in their cutting recently. Such rough edges on that poor stem, as though the blade was damaged or the person was working in considerable haste. Ellison's sharp intake of breath and instinctive glance toward his jacket pocket, where the distinctive notched penknife resided, provided exactly the confirmation Miss Marple had expected. The conversation continued with deceptive gentleness as Miss Marple introduced seemingly random observations about young Tommy Pierce's sharp memory for musical details, the distinctive squeaking of certain footwear, and the curious timing of Mrs. Nash's death in relation to her planned departure for the continent. Each comment struck Ellison like a precisely aimed dart, his responses becoming increasingly defensive while his nervous energy manifested in unconscious gestures that betrayed intimate knowledge of details he claimed never to have noticed. When Miss Marple casually mentioned the foreign automobile and its occupants' apparent satisfaction with recent developments, Ellison's carefully maintained facade finally began to crumble in earnest. His explanation of Mrs. Nash as a dangerous woman who had threatened village peace rang hollow when delivered with the passionate intensity of someone whose financial security had depended entirely on her continued silence about witnessed crimes, while his insistence that Harold's guilt was obvious revealed intimate knowledge of evidence that only the true perpetrator could possess. The psychological pressure reached its crescendo when Miss Marple observed, with devastating mildness, that some people found themselves caught between dangerous alternatives that made desperate action seem like the only viable solution. Ellison's response transformed from nervous denial to something approaching panic as he realized that his carefully constructed deception was dissolving under the relentless scrutiny of someone who understood human natures far better than he had ever anticipated. "You don't understand the position she put me in," he whispered, his voice carrying the raw desperation of someone whose secret had been exposed after years of careful concealment. "The payments, the threats, the constant fear that everything would be discovered. She was going to destroy me, and Harold was the perfect solution. Everyone believed it because everyone wanted to believe it." The words tumbled out with the inevitable force of water through a broken dam, confirming every suspicion Miss Marple had developed through patient observation and careful deduction. As Ellison's confession revealed the full scope of his 15-year blackmail scheme and the calculated murder designed to silence his victim while implicating an innocent man, Miss Marple reflected on the dangerous intersection of respectability and criminal desperation that had transformed their peaceful village into a stage for international intrigue disguised as domestic tragedy. The woman who had slept in the wrong grave had indeed carried secrets extending far beyond contested inheritance, but her death had been orchestrated by someone whose comfortable existence depended entirely on maintaining silence about crimes witnessed years earlier, making her elimination both profitable and necessary for preserving the facade of musical devotion that had concealed such systematic evil beneath the most respectable appearances. Miss Marple understood that confronting Hubert Ellison would require the delicate precision of a surgeon removing a deeply embedded splinter, each movement calculated to expose the infection without allowing the patient to retreat into protective denial. She found him in the vestry the following morning, arranging sheet music with the obsessive attention of someone seeking control through familiar rituals. his movements betraying the nervous energy of a man whose carefully constructed world was beginning to crumble under the weight of accumulated evidence and mounting suspicion. "Good morning, Mr. Ellison." She greeted him with characteristic gentleness, her pale blue eyes taking careful inventory of his appearance, while her voice carried the soothing quality that had encouraged countless confessions over the years. Such a relief that this dreadful business with poor Mrs. Nash is finally approaching resolution, though one cannot help feeling that certain details remain troublingly unclear. Her observation hung in the air like incense, creating an atmosphere of expectant tension that made Ellison's hands tremble slightly as he continued his unnecessary reorganization of already perfectly arranged hymnal pages. The conversation began with seemingly innocent observations about the memorial garden visible through the vestry window, Miss Marple's comments about the white roses leading naturally to discussion of recent cutting techniques and the distinctive marks left by damaged blades. "Such rough edges on that poor stem," she remarked with gentle concern, as though the person was working in considerable haste, or perhaps using a tool that had seen better days. Ellison's instinctive glance toward his jacket pocket, where the notched penknife resided, provided exactly the confirmation Miss Marple had anticipated, while his nervous explanation about reed adjustments and string maintenance carried the hollow ring of prepared excuses delivered under unexpected pressure. Young Tommy Pierce's sharp observations provided the next thread in Miss Marple's methodical unraveling of Ellison's deception, her casual mention of the boy's remarkable memory for musical details striking the organist like precisely aimed arrows. "Children notice the most extraordinary things," she observed with innocent appreciation. "Particularly distinctive sounds like whistling." Tommy was quite specific about the tune he heard, something sacred and rather complex. "Eternal Father, strong to save," I believe he said, though of course Harold Enderby has never been able to carry a melody in his life. The unconscious demonstration of musical ability that followed, as Ellison hummed the hymn before catching himself, provided devastating evidence of his presence at the scene during the crucial time period. The envelope addressed to H.E. became the centerpiece of Miss Marple's psychological assault. Her gentle suggestion that mistaken identity might explain the confusion striking Ellison with the force of revelation. "Such an easy mistake to make with shared initials," she observed mildly, "particularly when someone is seeking discreet communication with a person of musical sensibilities rather than obvious family connections." The implication that Mrs. Nash had intended her desperate message for the organist rather than Harold Enderby transformed coincidence into deliberate deception, revealing the true nature of their clandestine relationship and the financial arrangements that had bound them together for 15 years. Physical evidence accumulated with inexorable precision as Miss Marple continued her gentle interrogation, each detail building upon the previous revelation to create an overwhelming case against the increasingly desperate organist. The green stains on his thumb, the distinctive squeaking of his borrowed boots, the damaged penknife with its characteristic notch pattern, and most damaging of all, the medical vial recovered from the old well bearing his fingerprints and traces of the sedative found in Mrs. Nash's system, all combined to paint a picture of calculated murder disguised as domestic tragedy. "You see, Mr. Ellison," Miss Marple continued with devastating mildness, "Mrs. Nash wasn't returning to settle old scores or pursue romantic reconciliation. She was fleeing for her life from dangerous associates in Barcelona, carrying secrets about currency manipulation and document forgery that made her both valuable and dangerous to multiple parties. Your position as church organist provided perfect cover for witnessing her activities 15 years ago, leading to the blackmail arrangement that had supported your comfortable lifestyle while ensuring her continued exile from England." The psychological pressure reached its crescendo when Miss Marple observed that some people found themselves trapped between impossible alternatives that made desperate action seem like the only viable solution. Ellison's carefully maintained facade finally crumbled under the relentless scrutiny of someone who understood human nature far better than he had ever anticipated. his responses transforming from nervous denial to something approaching panic as he realized that his deception was dissolving beyond any hope of recovery. "She was going to destroy everything," he whispered, his voice carrying the raw desperation of someone whose secret had been exposed after years of careful concealment. The payments, the threats, the constant fear of discovery. Harold was the perfect solution because everyone wanted to believe his guilt. The staging, the symbolism, it all seemed so appropriate for someone who had brought such ruin into my life. The words tumbled forth with the inevitable force of confession that could no longer be contained, revealing the full scope of his 15-year blackmail scheme and the calculated murder designed to silence his victim while implicating an innocent man. As Inspector Slack materialized in the doorway, having heard sufficient confession to ensure Ellison's immediate arrest, Miss Marple reflected on the dangerous intersection of respectability and criminal desperation that had transformed their peaceful village into a stage for international intrigue disguised as domestic murder. The woman who had slept in the wrong grave had indeed carried secrets extending far beyond contested inheritance. But her death had been orchestrated by someone whose comfortable existence depended entirely on maintaining silence about crimes witnessed years earlier, making her elimination both profitable and necessary for preserving the facade of religious devotion that had concealed such systematic evil beneath the most respectable appearances. The arrest of Hubert Ellison proceeded with Inspector Slack's characteristic efficiency, yet the revelation of the organist's guilt sent tremors through St. Mary Mead that would disturb the village's peaceful equilibrium for months to come. Harold Enderby's release from custody, while legally satisfying, carried the bitter aftertaste of injustice narrowly averted, his reputation forever marked by suspicions that had seemed so reasonable when supported by circumstantial evidence and collective prejudice. The man who had spent 3 agonizing days protesting his innocence now faced the more complex challenge of rebuilding relationships with neighbors who had proven entirely too eager to believe in his capacity for calculated murder. That evening, Mrs. Bantry's drawing room became the stage for the sort of revelation scene that had made Miss Marple's reputation throughout the county, though the assembled company bore little resemblance to the confident group that had gathered to dissect village gossip just days earlier. Inspector Slack sat with the rigid posture of a man whose professional certainty had been thoroughly shaken, while Dr. Haydock occupied his familiar position by the fireplace with uncharacteristic gravity. Harold Enderby, pale and exhausted from his ordeal, perched on the edge of his chair, like a man still uncertain of his freedom, and Reverend Clement struggled to maintain pastoral composure, while wrestling with the spiritual implications of such betrayal within his sacred walls. Miss Marple settled into her accustomed chair with the quiet authority of someone who had unraveled the truth through patient observation rather than dramatic revelation. "You see," she began in her gentle voice, "this was never really about contested inheritances or romantic reconciliation, though those elements provided convenient camouflage for much darker purposes. Mrs. Nash returned to England not by choice, but because she was fleeing for her life from dangerous associates in Barcelona who had grown impatient with delays in settling her late husband's questionable business accounts. The international dimensions of the case emerged with crystalline clarity as Miss Marple explained how Ellison's position 15 years earlier as music teacher to the Nash children had provided him with intimate knowledge of document forgery and currency manipulation that formed the foundation of their import business. His decision to exploit this information through systematic blackmail had transformed him from struggling musician into comfortable village fixture, while binding Mrs. Nash to a life of permanent exile and constant financial drain that had finally become unsustainable when her husband's death exposed their criminal enterprises to official scrutiny. The envelope addressed to H.E. was indeed intended for Hubert rather than Harold, Miss Marple continued, her pale blue eyes taking in each shocked face with compassionate understanding. Mrs. Nash sought a final meeting to negotiate the end of their arrangement, offering substantial payment in exchange for documents that could implicate them both. But Mr. Ellison realized that her desperation made her dangerous, while her elimination would serve multiple purposes: silencing a witness, ending the blackmail payments, and providing a convenient scapegoat in Harold, whose obvious motive and village reputation made him the perfect suspect. The theatrical staging of the murder revealed artistic sensibilities that extended far beyond musical composition, demonstrating Ellison's understanding of symbolic communication and narrative psychology. His choice of Harold's uncle's grave had been calculated to provide obvious motive and convenient scapegoat, while the white rose placement carried layers of meaning that spoke to both Mrs. Nash's lost innocence and present corruption. The careful arrangement of her body, positioned with ceremonial precision despite the urgency of his circumstances, reflected a mind that thought in terms of dramatic effect and understood the power of visual metaphor to shape interpretation. The sedative he used was carefully chosen, Dr. Haydock interjected with professional precision, calculated to precipitate cardiac arrest in someone with Mrs. Nash's husband had diverted before his convenient death. Their patient surveillance throughout the fate and immediate departure following news of her death indicated professional competence that made her elimination both urgent and necessary for parties operating across international boundaries with ruthless efficiency. As the immediate shock subsided and the assembled company began to disperse into the gathering dusk, Miss Marple reflected on the peculiar nature of evil in small communities. Mr. Ellison's greatest protection was our own reluctance to see darkness where we expected light, she observed quietly. His position as church organist provided not merely professional cover, but psychological camouflage that rendered his true nature invisible to parishioners who associated musical devotion with spiritual purity. In the days that followed, St. Mary Mead resumed its familiar rhythms with the determined normalcy of a community healing from unexpected trauma. The bunting was carefully folded away, the memorial garden tended with renewed attention, and the white rose bushes pruned with proper secateurs rather than damaged penknives. Yet subtle changes marked the village's social landscape. Conversations carried new undercurrents of wariness, familiar faces bore the marks of disillusionment, and the church itself would require time to recover from the violation of its sacred spaces by someone whose musical gifts had concealed such systematic corruption. Harold Enderby, his ordeal having stripped away much of his superficial arrogance, spent quiet hours tending his garden with newfound humility, often pausing to gaze toward the churchyard, where he had so narrowly escaped becoming the victim of circumstances beyond his control. The experience had forced him to confront his own capacity for resentment, while demonstrating how easily reputation and assumption could combine to destroy an innocent life. Miss Marple, resuming her evening walks through the village lanes, observed these adjustments with the patient understanding of someone who had witnessed human nature in all its complexity. The woman who had slept in the wrong grave had indeed carried secrets extending far beyond contested inheritance, but her death had revealed even darker truths about the capacity for deception and moral corruption that could flourish beneath the most respectable appearances, requiring patience and careful observation to untangle the threads of motive, opportunity, and moral failure that combined to create such tragic consequences in even the most peaceful of English villages. The weeks following Hubert Ellison's arrest brought to St. Mary Mead the peculiar quiet that follows profound shock, a silence born not of peace, but of collective bewilderment as residents struggled to reconcile their memories of a dedicated organist with evidence of someone capable of such calculated deception. The trial proceedings that unfolded in the county courthouse revealed the full scope of international conspiracy that had transformed their peaceful village into a stage for murder, with testimony exposing Mrs. Nash's late husband's currency manipulation schemes across multiple European borders and the systematic blackmail that had funded Ellison's comfortable existence for 15 years. Harold Enderby's vindication carried the bitter satisfaction of justice delayed, but ultimately delivered, though his experience of wrongful accusation had left permanent marks on both his character and his relationship with neighbors who had proven entirely too eager to believe in his capacity for calculated murder. The arrogant bluster that had once characterized him had been replaced by quiet humility, visible in his meticulous tending of his garden roses, while his gaze frequently drifted toward the churchyard, where he had so narrowly escaped becoming the victim of circumstances beyond his control. His testimony about the psychological torture of imprisonment for crimes he had not committed provided sobering commentary on the fragility of reputation and the dangerous power of circumstantial evidence when supported by community prejudice. Village reaction to the revelations proved as complex as the crime itself, with Mrs. Bantry's usual pronouncements on village affairs now tempered by newfound reticence, her gossiping sessions growing noticeably quieter and punctuated by longer, more thoughtful silences. Mrs. Price handled the mail with uncharacteristic solemnity, her usual inquisitiveness replaced by guardedness that suggested painful re-evaluation of surface impressions, while the network of village gossip operated with cautious uncertainty, as if everyone feared what new, unsettling truths might yet surface beneath familiar facades. Reverend Clement struggled visibly with the spiritual ramifications of Ellison's betrayal, conducting elaborate purification ceremonies while wrestling with theological questions about evil that could flourish so successfully within the very heart of Christian worship. His sermons touched on themes of hidden sin and deceptive appearances, seeking to guide his flock through a landscape of shaken faith, while the organ stood silent for extended periods, its powerful voice awaiting new hands to infuse it with genuine purity rather than calculated deception. The international dimensions revealed during testimony attracted attention from Scotland Yard and various European authorities, demonstrating connections that extended far beyond St. Mary Mead's boundaries into realms of organized crime and financial manipulation operating across national borders with sophisticated efficiency. Dr. Haydock's medical testimony provided crucial evidence about the calculated nature of Ellison's method, showing how the organist had exploited his knowledge of Mrs. Nash's medical history to select sedatives that would precipitate cardiac arrest while leaving minimal forensic evidence, reflecting not momentary passion, but weeks of careful planning. Young Tommy Pierce's testimony provided some of the most compelling evidence against Ellison, the boy's sharp memory for musical details and distinctive sounds, creating unshakable identification that contradicted every claim of innocence the defendant had maintained. His description of the whistling gentleman in brown felt hat matched Ellison's unconscious habits with devastating precision, while his observations of squeaky boots and furtive behavior around the memorial garden provided temporal framework establishing opportunity during crucial time periods. As the trial reached its inevitable conclusion with Ellison's conviction and sentencing to life imprisonment, Miss Marple reflected on the peculiar nature of evil in small communities, where respectability provided perfect camouflage for criminal activities that could flourish undetected beneath the surface of ordinary village life. She observed how residents began looking at each other differently, subtle veils of suspicion having descended, making familiar faces seem less transparent, less entirely known than before. The memorial garden flourished despite everything, perhaps because of it, with damaged stems pruned proper and clean, new growth coming bright and purposeful as though the plants had understood lessons about economy and renewal. Miss Marple, passing there one evening, noticed trailing ribbon of green tape caught beneath the yew and collected it with characteristic neatness, not as evidence now, but as token of memory. Reminder that entire edifice of falsehood had swung from so small a strand. She thought of clues that had seemed like nothing at the time. The squeak of shoes, the shape of notch in blade, the whistle of tune that only musician would keep time to without knowing, and how often large cruelties betrayed themselves through such modest ticks of habit. If she felt pride, it was the quiet kind that keeps house in the heart and refuses to boast. Mostly, she felt familiar melancholy that follows solved puzzles, for solutions rarely restore what puzzles have broken. The village would return to semblance of its former self, shocking events fading into local legend retold with diminishing horror and increasing distance, but the comfortable assumption of inherent goodness had been irrevocably lost. The cozy facade had been peeled back, revealing intricate webs of resentment, betrayal, and international intrigue that could fester beneath even the most tranquil exteriors. Miss Marple understood that such tragedies were not anomalies but stark illustrations of universal human frailties played out on the small, intimate stage of village life. Yet she believed, as she had always believed, that kindness was the best revenge upon wickedness because it rebuilds what spite seeks to pull down, and so she continued with her visiting and knitting and observations that pretended to be misunderstandings. The woman who had slept in the wrong grave had, in death, awakened St. Mary Mead to uncomfortable truth that evil often wore the most familiar and trusted faces, requiring vigilance tempered with compassion to distinguish genuine virtue from its carefully constructed imitations. Autumn settled over St. Mary Mead with the gentle persistence of healing, bringing with it the kind of peace that follows profound disruption, not the innocent tranquility of before, but something deeper and more precious for having been tested. The memorial garden bloomed with particular abundance, as though nature itself sought to restore beauty where human corruption had left its stains, while the white rose bushes produced flowers of exceptional quality under careful tending that employed proper secateurs rather than damaged penknives wielded in desperate haste. Harold Enderby's transformation proved the most remarkable consequence of events that had nearly destroyed him, his former arrogance replaced by genuine humility that made him unexpectedly welcome among neighbors who had previously found his company insufferable. His garden had become a showcase of patient cultivation, each plant tended with the meticulous attention of someone who understood how easily appearances could deceive and how much effort was required to nurture authentic beauty rather than superficial impression. He visited the churchyard regularly now, not from morbid fascination but from gratitude for his narrow escape, often exchanging quiet nods with other residents who had learned similar lessons about the fragility of reputation and the dangerous power of assumption. Village social dynamics had shifted in ways both subtle and profound, with Mrs. Bantry's drawing-room gatherings growing notably smaller and more circumspect as residents discovered that gossip carried unexpected dangers when directed toward individuals whose true natures remained unknown. Mrs. Price handled correspondence with newfound discretion, her natural curiosity tempered by awareness that misdirected mail could facilitate criminal enterprises operating beneath the surface of ordinary village life. While her position as unofficial information hub now carried responsibilities she had never previously considered. The church itself had undergone both physical and spiritual renovation under Reverend Clement's determined guidance, with elaborate purification ceremonies conducted to cleanse spaces that had been violated by criminal conspiracy. The organ remained silent for extended periods, while a young schoolmistress named Miss Larkin, who played without flourishes and with steady, conscientious touch, gradually restored music to services with plain hymnody that proved surprisingly healing after the elaborate voluntaries that had so recently disguised discordant motives. Dr. Haydock's medical practice had expanded to include gentle counseling for residents struggling to process the revelation that evil could flourish so successfully among them, his waiting room frequently occupied by individuals seeking reassurance about the true nature of familiar faces. His professional observations about the calculated nature of Ellison's crime had made him something of an expert on deceptive personalities, though he privately confessed to Miss Marple that such expertise brought little comfort when applied to daily interactions with neighbors. Young Tommy Pierce had become something of a local celebrity following his crucial testimony, his sharp observational skills now regarded as valuable assets rather than childhood nuisances. Miss Marple, encountering him by the memorial garden, pressed into his palm a small folding magnifier that had once belonged to a botanically inclined cousin, telling him without solemnity that noticing was both a gift and a duty, and that one must take care not to become proud of duties. As winter approached and the anniversary of Mrs. Nash's death drew near, Miss Marple reflected on the enduring lessons embedded within events that had initially seemed like simple domestic tragedy. She thought of the phrase that had passed from whisper to headline and back to whisper again, the woman who slept in the wrong grave, and decided that it was not wrongness but misplacement that gave the story its sting. Althea Fairfax Nash had been misplaced long before her body was arranged among the boards and clay, misplaced in affection, in loyalty, in the calculations of men whose arithmetic kept omitting persons in favor of sums. Her evening walks continued with undiminished pleasure, though her observations now carried additional weight as neighbors sought her guidance in navigating relationships that required new levels of discernment. The gentle art of detection that had served her so well in exposing criminal deception now found application in helping others develop the observational skills necessary for protecting their community from future infiltration by those who would exploit trust for personal advantage. In her cottage that afternoon, the sun coming in low and steady across the geraniums, Miss Marple set aside her knitting to put away small objects of memory she kept in a biscuit tin, adding now the modest length of green florist's tape she had rescued from beneath the yew. No longer evidence but reminder that harm often depended upon the ordinary to carry it forward. When pressed, as always for her method, she described it as pattern recognition of a very domestic sort, a stitch that was not like its neighbors, a seam that lay too flat because something had been trimmed away, a color repeated once too often. When one had knitted as much as one had lived, she said with a small smile, one knew when the right side and the wrong side had been exchanged. The village would never return to its former innocence, that comfortable assumption of inherent goodness having been permanently altered by evidence that evil could wear the most trusted masks. Yet Miss Marple believed, as she had always believed, that knowledge of human frailty, however painful, provided better foundation for genuine community than willful blindness to uncomfortable possibilities. St. Mary Mead had learned that vigilant kindness remained the most effective defense against those who would prey upon the innocent trust that made civilized life possible.